Hey there, let's talk about the new firmware version 1.6 for the Canon R5. And the first thing I want to talk about and get this out of the way is going to be the supposed new improvement for the stabilization in this camera. Now, I'm not much of a handheld vlogger, but right now I'm shooting on the RF 15 to 35 at 15 millimeters. I have the stabilization on in the lens and of course with the IBIS as well, but I have the electronic turned off and I'm curious how the wobbles are in the corner. But I want to compare this also with this same setup, now turn the electronic stabilization on. Now I have the electronic stabilization turned on, not on enhanced, but on, in addition to the lens stab and the IBIS, so that's what this looks like. Now in the firmware update, it said it was going to improve the electronic image stabilization. Not sure if it did anything to the IBIS, and I think that's what most people were concerned about. This is not the most exciting thing about this firmware update. I have a lot of things to talk about with this. I have some mixed feelings about this as a longtime Canon user, and you're probably also wondering why I have a Canon R5. Hopefully the stabilization is a little bit better. I didn't get a chance to record before updating the firmware, so I don't have a way to compare it, but maybe it'll get better over time. I know a lot of people were really not liking those wobbles. Okay, so there are four main things for this firmware update. Of course, the image stabilization that I mentioned. There's also something about HEIF files. Again, I'm not much of a photographer, so that wasn't something I was interested in. The big one is they have basically removed overheating from the Canon R5. And I did some tests, which I'll share with you later in this video, but they now have an auto temp power off setting. They can go from standard to high, just like they have in the Sony cameras. And lastly, there are some minor fixes. I'm not really sure what those are. They weren't specified, so we have a lot to talk about in this video. Firstly, and probably the most important thing, of course, is the overheating. And I'll just spoil it up front. They basically eliminated overheating in this camera. And I wasn't able to test every possible situation and every possible frame rate and mode, but I wanted to do a few tests just to get a sense of, does this camera overheat anymore and will it work for me? So I'm not going to be doing any more tests because frankly, these tests take a long time to run and then you have to wait for the camera to cool down. But I think what I tested will give you a good sense of that. And I'll say with confidence that this camera basically doesn't overheat anymore, which is awesome. I also have mixed feelings about that, as I said, which I'll get into later on. So for all these tests, I shot them in C-Log 3 and I used my ProGrade V90 SD card, the 256 gig card. I don't have any of the CF Express cards right now. But that's what I used, and I obviously had the auto temp power off setting to high so it wouldn't overheat. So we'll run through these tests. The first series of tests I ran indoors, so that was in my studio, which was around 75 degrees Fahrenheit, mainly because I just wanted to know what it would do inside, but also when I updated the firmware, it was raining and then getting dark outside, and I did some tests outside in sort of really hot weather too to see how that would do. So let's go through these tests really quickly. So 4K Fine is the most important mode to me and probably to most of you. You probably know that 4K Fine is that 8K oversample to 4K mode, produces amazing detail and sharpness. It's also in the R5C, and the R7 has a 7K oversample to 4K Fine mode, which is awesome as well. So one of the reasons I was not happy about this camera originally was the line skip 4K. So again, having 4K Fine not overheating is huge. All right, so let's get on to the test, like I said. So the first test is 4K Fine UHD 24 frames a second in IPB. This ran until the battery died at 1 hour and 40 minutes. Now keep in mind to have to constantly restart the camera every 30 minutes, but I was trying to be really good about it and just get it started up right away. So as far as I'm concerned, indoors, IPB, 4K Fine does not overheat. So now I wanted to check out the All-I. So in this mode, the 4K Fine in All-I in 24 frames a second, basically this ran until the card filled up, and that was 1 hour and 12 minutes. So not overheating in 4K Fine in All-I as well in 24 frames a second. The last test I did inside was 8K at 24 frames a second, and I could only do this in IPB because of my card, but basically the card filled up after 50 minutes. No overheating, no overheat warning, no issues whatsoever inside with any of those modes. So again, I didn't check 4K 60, 4K 120, but frankly, I just don't run those for very long periods of time, and I'm guessing they probably don't have a problem either. Okay, so now I really want to do a stress test on it, and I put the camera outside in the full sun this morning. It was probably 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit when I did the recording. I'm in North Carolina. It was crazy humid. It was hot outside for sure. So for this test, I ran 4K Fine 24 frames per second in IPB, and I did get the camera to overheat, but it was 1 hour and 34 minutes in, and the battery was just about dead. When I went back to restart the camera after a few minutes of cooling down, it only ran for a couple more minutes. So basically it ran until the battery died, and it was an extremely hot situation. Like I would never record just the camera running for 1.5 hours in the full sun. Like that would never happen. If I was outside filming, it would be on and off, and I think it wouldn't be a problem at all. So again, pretty much overheating is solved. And just to compare this with the R7, because I've done overheating tests with that, in the 4K fine mode, it ran for an hour and 1 minute. So in a similar situation out in the heat, and that was an IPB. So the R5 now in the 4K fine mode will run even longer than the R7, which is awesome. So we talked about 3 of the 4 updates, and the last one is the minor fixes, and we have no idea what that is. Now, one question mark I have is about dynamic range, because most of you know, if you're watching this, that the R5C has more dynamic range than the R5, even though they both shoot in C-Log 3. So I'm wondering and hoping that maybe they increase the dynamic range in this camera somehow. So let's do a couple tests here. I wanted to see how it do. Now, the camera that I have that has the most dynamic range right now is the C70. So here's 2 examples. We'll do the C70 versus the R5, and you guys take a look and guess which one's which, and then we'll talk about it. All right, so overall here, these images definitely look a little bit different. Of course, they're different cameras, and I was shooting in C-Log 2 on the C70 and C-Log 3 on the R5, but I think the dynamic range is pretty close. Now, I'll have to do some more testing. I don't have a way to accurately measure stops of dynamic range, but I'll be curious. I think I'm gonna put the R5 through its paces now with this new firmware and see if it's closer, because I always felt that the dynamic range in the R5 was a little bit lower than it probably should have been. So maybe it got better. I'm not sure. More exploration is definitely needed. Also, I forgot to mention that I'm shooting on the R5 this whole time. That's why I'm outside and trying to do something different. I get sick of sort of sitting behind my desk all the time, and I figure, you know what? This camera doesn't overheat anymore, so let's film on the R5. All right, now on to my thoughts about this update, and I have some notes here, so I apologize for looking down. This might be kind of a mini rant, and I apologize for that, but overall, I am really happy that the R5 the overheating has been eliminated in this camera, but I'm also kind of upset about it, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So as a longtime Canon user, when the R5 got announced 2 years ago, and everyone's excited about all the video capabilities of this camera, and then the overheating came out, and it just turned into a fiasco, and it was a big marketing problem, but I also think that Canon was, you know, hiding the fact that this camera didn't have this problem. It was false overheating. People were popping the battery out to restart it. You guys know the whole saga. And now the timing of this is just definitely interesting. And so that's part of it too. But I just think about the last 2 years of all the loyal Canon users that were frustrated with this, having to shoot externally, dealing with overheating, all these workarounds when the camera could do this already. There's no hardware that was changed in this camera. It was just software. So it just makes me wonder about the whole thing. And I know that Canon is, you know, people talk about Canon having like a cripple hammer and protecting their, you know, more expensive cameras. And I can't give any other reason for why that's not true. So, you know, keeping this camera from overheating, this camera had higher specs than a lot of their cinema cameras in terms of shooting video. So that was a way for you to say, well, if you need a reliable video camera, go buy this cinema camera. So now the overheating is eliminated, so that's not really there. But the bigger question with the timing of this, I think, has to do with the R5C. So people were wanting a hybrid camera that could shoot really high quality video, and the R5C came out. But now, even a few months after the release, most of the R5C units have sold. There's a lot of people, I think pretty much everyone who wanted one has one at this point. I'm sure they'll keep selling them over time. And there are some extra features in the R5C. But the timing of the overheating being eliminated on the R5 is just weird. And like, they could have done this months ago or a year ago or whatever. So I think they were just protecting the sales of their R5C. That's just my personal thoughts. I have no information to back this up. Now, there's a couple of differences, of course, with the R5 and the R5C, and I'll probably make a separate video about this. But one of the biggest things is the 30-minute record limit that still remains on this camera, even though it was eliminated on much cheaper cameras like the R7 and the R10. And I think that's really just to protect the R5C. Now, again, there are other features on the R5C like XF AVC codec, monitoring tools, 8K 60, oversampled 4K 60, and a bunch of other stuff. But like the 30-minute record limit, I think, is still there to protect the R5C. So anyways, overall, I'm happy it's gone. I just feel bad for all the Canon users who maybe ditched Canon and went to Sony or some other company, myself included. I was really frustrated with the R5 overheating, and that just didn't work for me, and now it doesn't. So I don't know. I'm hoping that this will allow Canon to be more competitive, and I think because we've just seen a recent firmware about the FX3, which I made a video about, actually a couple videos about, I'll leave those linked down below if you're curious. I think there's just a game of chess going on here with Canon and Sony, which we all benefit from as consumers and users of these cameras. Well, sorry about that mini rant. Hopefully you can empathize with some of that if you've shot on Canon before and have been dealing with some of these issues. So now I want to talk about some of the things that frustrated me with the R5 originally, and some of the things they have changed, some things they haven't changed. So first of all, the overheating, they solved it. Okay, 30-minute record limit, it's still in there. It's crazy. They need to get rid of that. They need to get rid of that. Dynamic range. Now, when this camera was released, it only had C-Log. A little bit later, they did have a firmware update that put C-Log 3 in it, which has more dynamic range than C-Log. I would love to see C-Log 2 in this camera, but they didn't put it in the R5C either, which, if you don't know, C-Log 2 has more dynamic range than C-Log 3. So my question mark, which I already posed earlier, was, is the dynamic range now equal to the R5C or maybe just better than it was before? Not really sure, but I definitely think that dynamic range was lacking in the R5, and it was something that was holding this camera back. Obviously, we know this sensor can handle more because the R5C has better dynamic range. Micro HDMI port, obviously you can't change that because it's, it's hardware and it's still in the camera. And the last thing I really would love to see is some monitoring tools for shooting video in the R5. The R5C has great tools like waveform and false color, and at least give me the histogram when the camera's recording. So those are things that I have complaints about for shooting video. Of course, I'm not much of a photographer, so I'm coming at this at an angle of a videographer. Lastly, if you've been following this channel, you're probably wondering, Josh, why did you buy an R5? So I'll address that here too. So part of the thing about this channel and my camera usage is that I'm constantly changing up my camera lineup, and partly that is because I just enjoy the journey. I enjoy playing with these cameras and sharing that experience with all of you, because the more that I learn and can review and report on, I think the more helpful it'll be for everyone either looking to buy a new camera or decide which camera to get or trade or sell or whatever. And it's just kind of fun. I love these cameras. So I did sell my R5C, but that is a whole nother discussion. But basically I have a C70, which I absolutely love for shooting video. And the R5 is going to fill a different role in my lineup, which I'm pretty excited about. So first of all, it's an amazing photography camera. And as you know, I'm not much of a photographer. I hope to do more of that. I already have some amazing lenses for the RF mount, so I want to utilize those. This has better battery life than the R5C. That's one of the biggest things that drove me crazy about the R5C, that you had to rig out the camera. And for this kind of camera, I don't want to make it big. I'll take out my C70 that has incredible battery life. It's also cheaper than the R5C. And the other thing that really made me start thinking about the R5 again was I started hearing about the rumors and now the culmination of the new firmware update and getting rid of the overheating, and that definitely happened. So I'm really excited for this. I still have to figure out exactly where this fits in my whole lineup, but I do have this camera now to do some comparisons, and I've always loved the R5 except for the overheating and some of the other issues I mentioned before. Maybe some of those will get better, but the fact that I can just run the camera and not have to stress about it anymore makes me happy. I cannot deal with cameras that overheat. It just does not work in my life. Anyways, there's a lot to sort of unpack with this firmware update, even though it's kind of simple. I know it's kind of probably emotional for a lot of Canon users who've had so much frustration over the last few years, so I totally hear you. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and if you did, please consider hitting subscribe. There'll be more content on Canon and Sony cameras, stuff on videography, content creation, of course camera gear. So thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.